Thanks for joining us. This is your host, Taylor Bradley, and you're listening to the Troop HR podcast. Hello, and welcome to the podcast. My name is Taylor Bradley, your host, and today I'm joined with Angela Cheng-Cimini, who is the SVP of Talent and CHRO of Harvard Business Publishing. She has over 30 years of HR professional experience, a mother of 2 adult children, married her college sweetheart, and they are celebrating their 30-year anniversary next year, which a huge kudos. She has played an absolute pivotal role in the evolution of HR and continues to work towards elevating organizations and individuals to the best versions of themselves. So, Angela, welcome to the podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to spending time with you.
We're going to discuss today 2020. I feel like every year since 2020, I start out with a bingo card of like unusual or wild events that occur. So when I mention 2024, what are 2 to 3 focus areas that stand out to you that our HR leaders will be facing in 2024?
Well, another pandemic notwithstanding, I actually think it's just going to be a lot more of the same. So I think that organizations are going to continue to have to think about the mental well-being of their folks. I think we're going to have to continue to process what Gen AI means for how we do our work. And I think finally, employees are going to continue to use their voice to demand that their work environment is hospitable and allows them to thrive. They're not going to withstand poor pay, inflexible work weeks, and leadership that doesn't allow them to grow.
Flexibility has been something that I've heard as a consistent keyword when speaking to HR leaders. What do you think, aside from offering hybrid work solutions or in-office or fully remote, what are some other ways that you think that leaders can be flexible in 2024 for their workforces?
That's a great question, Taylor. I think that's a nut we still haven't cracked. We've seen a lot of the large banking moguls requiring people to return back to the office. I think that's trying to bring back a world that doesn't exist. It's continuing to lean in to how we can find the optimal way where employees can be productive and still meet the business objectives. For us, we've gone work where you can be most productive, best of both. So the office is open 24/7, and so is your home. So wherever you can get your best work done for that day, for that kind of work in that moment, you get to choose. And if that gets to be a problem, then we'll have a conversation, but we're going to lead with trust. We're going to lead with positive intent. We're going to continue to provide opportunities for people to come together because we do know that in real life does things for community that virtual, no matter how technologically advanced, just can't duplicate. So I think mandates for all sorts of reasons don't work. Even vaccination mandates didn't work, right? I mean, that was not a 100% take up rate for everybody. Flexibility is really about having a conversation with that employee, individualized. There's no one size fits all, no cookie cutter approach.
For those of us that have attended your sessions before or listened to the podcast that you've previously been on, you've discussed this idea of hyper-personalization in several different areas. Can you give our listeners a TLDR of what hyper-personalization is and then maybe some examples of what that looks like?
Yeah, hyper-personalization goes back to my earlier point about employees continuing to use their voice to demand the experience that they want. And that looks very different from person to person. I've been reading a lot of research that early career employees actually like to be in the office, right? Because that's where they're learning hands-on. That's when they're doing observation. That's when they can get feedback spontaneously and in the moment. But folks who are later career, who sort of know the ropes, understand how to navigate all the different waters that they may come across, don't need that same level of exposure. So it's going to be different to a person. I think the whole movement with pay transparency is sort of the same thing. People don't really care how they're paying 99% of the population. They want to know how they themselves are being paid, right? That's about as hyper-personalized as it gets. I think that healthcare is next on the horizon. People are going to want to know how their premium dollars are being spent. They don't want to pay for cancer coverage, for example, but they may really want to over-index on cardiac care. Depending on what their family history is, what their DNA tells them, how they live their lifestyle. Learning and development, right? What I need for upskilling is going to look very different from the person in the next queue next to me. So hyper-personalization, to the extent that employers can meet employees where they're at, that's going to deliver the best experience.
I love that. And I want to table just for a moment pay transparency and circle back to that. But something that you mentioned at the beginning of the call, which is near and dear to my heart. I've lost a best friend of mine to mental health struggles. And you had mentioned that mental health will be a key topic in 2024. What are some practical ways that our leaders can embrace that to provide a positive environment without crossing the line of getting too in depth with someone's medical history or medical issues?
Yeah, Taylor, we struggle with this still. I mean, you use the word practical. Increasingly, employers have taken on burden where government in America used to provide, right? So if you need health benefits, you better have a job. Are you saving for retirement? You better have a job. Are you lonely? You better have a manager who takes care of you on the job. And so when I hesitate about what's practical, increasingly we are asking managers to be all things to their employees and be hyper-personalized, right? So they have to be a therapist. They have to be a financial planner. They also have to be a career consultant. They also have to be a business partner, because at the end of the day, they have to make sure that the organization performs. Is it practical to ask our managers to be all those things? I think not, but here we are. Again, employees are demanding that their work provides all of those support mechanisms, and I'm not sure that it's the best delivery for that. Organizations are trying to do that because that is what their employees are asking for. One of the things that we are asking our managers to be is empathetic and compassionate, which of course is a wonderful thing, but they don't necessarily have the skills or are equipped to do that. So how do we find time to give them the training to do that? How do we find time to have those kinds of conversations that can't be had in 15 minutes? Sometimes you're unpacking something that's really deep for half an hour. And how deep you go and how personal you go is really dependent on the kind of relationship you have with your manager. If you trust them and they're the kind of leader that wants to help you, then you're going to talk about that for a long time. If you don't, then it's going to be a closed door pretty quickly. So again, hyper-personalized. But is it practical? I don't know, but we're trying. We're trying.
And you sit at an interesting intersection between academics. You have a lot of insight into research. What about the different types of mental health tools that are being introduced in the workplace? Have you seen that to be beneficial in the aggregate?
So one of the things we've done, I think with a fair degree of success, is we have first aid mental counselors. So like a first aider who's trained in CPR. These folks are trained to just give enough relief until the experts can step in. It's really just crisis intervention. And so we've certified 24 of our employees through the National Council of Wellbeing. It's a fantastic organization. Their portfolio of logos is really impressive. Boeing and Revlon and Starbucks are all their clients. So we are in very good company, and it's a full day, an 8-hour certification, and helps them to recognize when employees are in distress. And that's different from going to HR or going to your manager, because these are your peers. These are people who understand your workplace, but don't necessarily have any insight as to what your day-to-day looks like. And so they can really just be there in a moment, not to judge, but just to take the edge off and then give you resources like your EAP, like your primary care physician, like your family who may be in a position to help once the urgency of the situation has passed. So that has been something that we've been using to great effect, and lots of organizations are doing the same. But I also think that the EAP is an underutilized resource. Most people say, like, yeah, I know I have an EAP. But there are some out there that are doing some absolutely fantastic work. And I encourage employees and employers to do more PR, to do more exploration, because that's what they do. So they're truly experts at that resource.
And that's the National Council of Wellbeing?
It is.
Was that the correct?
Yeah.
Oh, perfect. I think that's something all of our listeners should go investigate. As a first responder or former first responder myself, I appreciate that those resources exist. That's new for me. So I'm going to be looking that up as well. Now, another aspect of well-being is financial well-being. And this is where I want to pivot into the pay transparency. You've had a lot of great talks about this in the past, and I would encourage our Troop HR listeners to go on to Troop HR to look up some of Angela's prior sessions. But what do you think are going to be some of the key topics around pay transparency in 2024?
So I think equity. The whole objective is to close the gender wage gap, but there's actually so many more dimensions of pay that don't have anything to do with gender, but have to do with race or whether or not someone went to university, whether someone's a first generation, whether English is their first language, right? There are so many things that determine whether or not someone gets paid fairly, whether they're a good negotiator out of the blocks, right, is a major factor. So I think, again, back to hyper-personalization, our organizations paying for those components of pay that truly drive and reward performance. We recently just went through an equity study with a third party, and I'm really pleased to say that our compensation program is doing just that. It's paying for performance, it's paying for experience, and there is very little bias in our system. So it's looking at the right things, and every organization ought to do that. And if you do choose to undertake a pay equity study, please do so under the guidance of legal counsel, because anything you discover could be discoverable, and you want to make sure that you manage any implosions in that regard very strategically. But it is important work and work that every HR department should be undertaking, for sure.
That's a great call out for our listeners as well, to always consult your legal counsel on any types of these issues, because that'll be unique to your organization. You mentioned paying for performance, and this is an area that I feel a lot of HR leaders are struggling with. How do you pay differently, but also pay equitably? Do you think you could give us some insight on that?
Yeah, so one of the things that we looked at when we did our pay equity study was for certain level performance, we look at 3 previous years' performance reviews. You take a look at what sort of industry experience. Have they had people leadership before? What are the industries in which they've had deep knowledge? And sort of there's a scoring rubric to all of that, so that people who look more or less alike, right? There's not going to be a perfect match, but more or less alike, are they being paid similarly? If there are differences, can you explain it? So, for example, if someone actually was on a performance improvement plan, okay, well, then you know to dock a few points. If they bring with them a PhD and the role that they're in requires more research, well, then you would give them bonus points for that. If are there certain skills and can they measurably demonstrate that they're bringing them to work, then you would give points for that or deduct points for that. So long as you're being consistent and can explain variations in pay, then you're probably in good stead. But yeah, you want to be really objective around what are the skills, what are the experiences that matter. Perhaps education, maybe not, but you want to make sure that any differences can be explained by gender or race or any other sort of discriminatory bias.
And one of the conferences I went to in 2016 as a vendor, we were there to recruit, was a Women in Tech conference in Boston. And one of the keynote speakers specifically called out to the crowd to not go to an organization that does not have a career architecture or compensation philosophy in place, because that could lead to inequitable pay. Hearing that statement, what comes to mind for you? What advice would you give to our listeners as well?
In an ideal world, every organization has a compensation architecture and pay philosophy. But I think that you may run the risk of unnecessarily closing yourself off to opportunities. I worked for a number of startups and a number of turnarounds who weren't mature and sophisticated enough and didn't have those things. And I helped implement them. And I like to think that I made those organizations stronger, better, faster as a result. And following that person's advice, that would not have been on my radar. So I think what I might caveat is start there. And if they don't, then delve into why. And do they have plans to rectify that? I wouldn't necessarily immediately write off an organization just because they don't. There are so few organizations that do everything perfectly or do everything right or have every piece in place. Those are only going to be a handful of very large, sophisticated, mature organizations. And there are lots of great career opportunities to be had in companies that aren't yet on that scale or on that maturity spectrum. But I would say just double click on that and ask them why.
That's a great advice, I believe, for our listeners. Now, a recent article that you've written is to be more visible at work. And I'm sure a lot of 2024 goals for individuals are increasing their visibility or increasing their personal brand or developing that as a tool for career growth. What advice would you have for listeners on that?
Oh, Taylor, I'm so flattered that you read the article. Yeah, I co-wrote it with Nicole Smith, and she's a fantastic partner of crime, and we're both women of color. So I think our life experiences help to shape both the reason that we wrote the article and the article itself, which is just doing good work isn't always going to be enough. People have to equate your good work with you. You want to put yourself in a position so that the next time you're being, quote, recruited, or teams have gaps and they're looking for another member, that people think of you. And that requires visibility. That does require professional PR about your brand, which is, exactly what you said. Are you ready in 30 seconds to explain what your strengths are, what you can add to a piece of work, an engagement, or a team, and talk about what's unique about you? If you don't, then it's worth spending some time putting that together, because you never know when the opportunity is going to come where you're going to have to explain why you're the next best person to be hired or to be placed on a team. Hooking up your train to people who can pull you along is a good thing. That's not just passive. That is actively making sure that you're seen with others who can share the spotlight with you, that their light can also cast light on you. It's not the same as brown nosing. It's not the same as ingratiating, because you are also doing good work, right? Your visibility is worthy of being highlighted. And so what we talk about is making sure that you raise your hand at opportune moments, that you speak up when you have something important to say. And that doesn't necessarily mean in the moment, right? If you're an extrovert, that's easy. But if you're an introvert, that means after the meeting, send an email and say, hey, you know what? I was thinking about something and I processed a little bit and I have this to add to the conversation, right? It doesn't always have to look like loud and vocal. It can be soft-spoken and thoughtful. But the point is to make yourself heard.
Absolutely love that. Another thing that you had mentioned in one of your previous talks that really resonated with me is having a circuitous career, and how coming from unique backgrounds, it may not always be an HR background. Can you share a little bit about your personal journey into HR and how you would define a circuitous career?
So it has always been in HR. In fact, it's what I studied as an undergrad. But I did jump around quite a bit. Taylor, I've not been anywhere longer than 3 years. I am desperately hoping that my tenure at HVP will break that record. And for a long time, that was a liability. And it wasn't until sort of the last 5 or 6 years when it was okay to have the kind of mobility that I have. So in the course of my 30-year career, that means I've had 10 different jobs. Not quite at 10 different organizations, but I have moved around quite a lot. And people would say, oh, she can't hold down a job. But actually, I think what it means is now I have this mosaic, a really textured career where I've been in startups, I've been in mature organizations, I've been in companies that are growing, I've been in those that have been on decline, I've been on nonprofit, I've been in manufacturing, I've been in professional services. And it hasn't always been a clear line from woodchuck to senior woodchuck to president of woodchucks, right? I mean, sometimes it's been a step back, sometimes it's been a lateral. But if I were to sit down and talk to an interviewer, I could explain why I made those moves. Some of them have been personal, some of them have been professional, and some of them have been a mix of both. And while it's not always easy to get the foot in the door, I think once I have had the chance to explain my story, people are pretty compelled by it. So don't be put off by what others think, because frankly, if an organization is so pigeonholed that they're only ever going to take HR because they've been in biotech, maybe I don't want to go there anyhow. Maybe I wouldn't be a good fit. Frankly, I think organizations that are willing to take a chance on someone with a different background says to me that they are willing to be experimental. They are willing to think outside the box and see value in diversity of experience.
I've had this similar career trajectory of tenure at organizations, and I had found that led to hyper growth in my career by making some of those strategic moves at that time.
Yes.
And in tech, at a former organization, we studied tenure, and we had found out of all the team members that currently worked at our organization in their previous roles, they had an average tenure of 2.35 years. And so it was interesting to see that there's that hyper mobility, especially in tech, and that's become more accepted, I think, in the past decade, certainly. So it's really interesting to hear that aspect of it. One quick follow-up before we transition here to the lightning round. Just want to circle back to 2024, right?
Okay.
We don't know what's going to be end for the year, what are going to be those unique things like the Silicon Valley Bank issue that happened last year? Just handling change or adapting to change. What advice would you have for our listeners in leading the organization to be more adaptable and resilient?
I was fortunate to spend some time with Ken Burns, the very famous historian, documentarian. And he said that one of the great life perspectives is over, next. So you go through an experience, you have an opportunity to reflect, but it's over. You can't change the past. All you can do is move on and react to it, respond to it in the best way that you know how. And you still might screw it up, but dwelling on the past, other than learning from those lessons, but dwelling on them, marinating in them, like overanalyzing them, only keeps you rooted there. And I find that resiliency is really about bouncing back from whatever has happened. Easier said than done, for sure. But I think one thing that I have learned coming out of the pandemic is that there is tremendous community, that people do want to connect. If anything, we now place more value on the time we do spend together. We make the most of that, right? You're so appreciative. My son got married this past May, and it was a time of such joy and celebration. I mean, weddings always are, but I think this one had a particular energy because it was 150 people there to celebrate love and joy and family. And I think we understood more viscerally than ever that those moments are rare and special. And so bad things are going to happen, but there are people who are willing to rally. Troop HR is a fantastic community for that. And kudos to Tracy Avon for building this wonderful place where we can just be and say, I don't know, or I'm struggling, or I need help, or I've got wisdom to share. I've been there, done that. Let me help you.
I love the optimistic tone on that, and congratulations on the wedding. That's exciting.
Thank you. Big deal.
So we'll transition to the lightning round to close us out. What is the best career advice you've been given in one sentence?
Go someplace where you can be happy. I've stayed at places too long. That's 2 sentences.
It's perfect, though. We'll add a comma in there or something. All right. Favorite HR tool or book right now?
Oh God, there's so many, right? I mean, I work at Harvard Business Publishing, so there are so many really, really good ones. Let's do the first 90 days. That's an oldie but a goodie.
It is a great book. And all right, one hot take HR opinion.
AI is not coming for us because it's artificial intelligence, and we're in the business of human intelligence. That's
for our listeners. I'm clapping right now. It's amazing. All right. And finally, how can our listeners connect with you?
Oh, sure. I am the only Angela Cheng-Cimini on LinkedIn. Let me know that you heard me speak with Taylor on the Troop HR podcast, and I'll be happy to connect.
All right. Thank you, Angela, for attending the podcast today. I feel like we could talk for hours and hours, but for everyone listening, please go check out Angela's talks on troophr.com or look her up. Just Google. There's all sorts of podcasts and articles out there featuring Angela. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me, Taylor.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Troop HR podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, we encourage you to subscribe and leave a 5-star rating. If you would like to learn more about our community, please visit troophr.com. In the meantime, keep living the dream.